Have you ever heard some pop psychology fact and thought, wait a minute, is that really true? Well, today, we're going to build the mental toolkit to figure that out. We're moving beyond just passively hearing about psychology facts and learning how to actually think like a psychologist. It's all about becoming a sharp, critical consumer of information about the human mind.
So let's start with a big one, a question you've probably heard before. Does listening to Mozart's music actually boost your intelligence? I mean, this is a claim that has sold millions of CDs and shaped how people think about parenting for decades. But is there any truth to it?
This whole idea got a catchy name, the Mozart effect. And boy, did it become a media sensation. The promise was just irresistible, right? A simple, easy way to make your baby smarter, to give yourself a mental edge. It was absolutely everywhere. A perfect example of a psychological idea that just completely captures the public's imagination.
Okay, now this is where it gets really interesting. Look at the massive gap between the hype and the reality. The media was shouting from the rooftops that Mozart boosts your overall intelligence. But the original study from 1993, it had just 36 college students. And they only showed a temporary improvement. We're talking 10 to 15 minutes on one very specific type of puzzle. That's it. This huge disconnect is exactly why we need to learn how to think like a researcher.
So, how do we cut through that kind of hype to get to what's real? Well, we need a system. We need what I like to call the scientist's secret weapon, the scientific method. This is the framework that helps us separate the solid evidence from all those sensational claims. At its heart, the scientific method isn't some rigid step-by-step recipe. It's really more of a concept, a whole way of approaching questions that's built on a specific logic for finding answers. And it all rests on two incredibly powerful pillars.
Pillar number one is the empirical approach. This is so fundamental. It just means we don't rely on gut feelings, tradition, or what everybody knows. We rely on evidence. Hard evidence from direct observation and experiments. Stuff we can actually see, measure, and test for ourselves. And the second pillar is a skeptical attitude. Now, hold on. This doesn't mean being cynical or just shooting everything down. Think of it more like being a good detective. A scientist wants to see it before they believe it. And then they want to see it again and again under different circumstances before they really accept a claim as true.
But here's the thing. Just having a method isn't the whole story. We've got to remember that science is a human activity. It doesn't happen in some sterile, isolated lab. It's always being shaped by the world around it, by history, by society, and even by morality.
You can see this so clearly in how psychology itself has changed over time. I mean, look at this timeline. For a huge chunk of the 20th century, behaviorism was king. The mind was treated like this unknowable black box. But then, the computer came along. This sparked the cognitive revolution because it gave scientists a brand new way to think about the mind, like an information processor. And suddenly, the focus was right back inside that box.
Now let's think about the social context. A huge piece of the puzzle comes from this very memorable acronym. It turns out that most people in psychology studies are weirdos. Think about that for a second. If most of our research is on this very specific slice of the world's population, how can we be so sure our findings apply to everyone else? It's a critical question about bias.
This exact problem has a name. It's called ethnocentric bias. It's basically what happens when we try to understand another culture but we're looking at it through the lens of our own. We don't even realize that our own cultural values are coloring everything we see. It's a huge potential pitfall that good researchers are always trying to avoid.
And then, of course, you have the moral context, which, wow, it can get incredibly tricky. For example, in one study, researchers found that men who handled a gun for a little while later added way more hot sauce to another person's drink. A pretty clever measure of aggression. But to get that result, they had to deceive the people in the study. So this raises a really tough question. Is what we learn about the link between guns and aggression worth that deception? There are no easy answers here, that's for sure.
Okay, so we've looked at the challenges, the context. Now let's get practical. How can you actually start to apply this mindset and think like a researcher in your own life?
First things first, you have to forget the idea of a single, perfect study that proves everything. It just doesn't exist. The real gold standard is what we call converging evidence. Think of it like a detective building a case. One clue? That's just a hint. But when you have lots of different studies, using different methods, all pointing toward the same conclusion, okay, that's when you can start to feel confident.
All right, I've got a number for you. 75%. Any guesses what that is? Well, that's the percentage of students who believe a really common myth about taking tests.
It's the myth that you should always stick with your first gut answer on a multiple-choice test. Sound familiar? But get this. Over 70 years of research, we're talking tons of converging evidence, shows the exact opposite is true. Most of the time, when people change their answers, they change them from wrong to right, and their scores actually go up. This is a perfect example of how using an evidence-based approach can bust a myth that almost everyone believes.
You know, the research process itself isn't some secret, mystical thing. It actually starts with some pretty simple steps. First, you ask a question. Then you form a hypothesis, which is really just a fancy word for a tentative, testable explanation. And then, importantly, you step back and ask, is this even a good question? Is the answer going to actually teach us something new?
And here's what that looks like in action. You might start with a really broad question, like, does media violence make people more aggressive? But a good researcher narrows that down. Instead of just passive watching, they might ask a more specific question. Does actively playing a violent video game have an even stronger effect on aggression? See, now that's something you can actually go out and test.
So, let's bring this all home. Thinking like a psychologist isn't about finding that one magical study that proves everything once and for all. It's about building a bigger, more complete, and much more reliable picture of reality.
And the absolute best way to build that picture is with what's called a multi-method approach. This is the big idea that to really understand something as complex as human behavior, you've got to come at it from a bunch of different angles, using different types of studies and different ways of measuring things.
Why is that so important? Well, because any single research method has its own flaws and limitations. An experiment in the lab might be too artificial. A survey depends on people telling the truth. But when you start combining them, the strengths of one method can make up for the weaknesses of another. It lets you fill in all the gaps and build a much more complete and trustworthy picture.
Which really brings us to the final critical question. If no single study is ever perfect, then how in the world do we decide what to believe? And the answer is the toolkit we've just put together. We look for that converging evidence, we keep that healthy skepticism, we always consider the context, and we put our trust in conclusions that are drawn from many different methods. It's not about finding absolute certainty. It's about navigating a very uncertain world with the best tools available. And now you've got them.